First up, let's focus on what has been happening in the United States of America. Well, Donald Trump returned to the White House for a second time, promising results. But as his administration moves through this second term, many of his biggest promises remain unfulfilled so far. To start with, the biggest promise of them all, no wars. Well, the Iran war continues to be a big hurdle for Trump. He's neither been able to get a deal as per American demands, nor convince Netanyahu to end his offensive against Lebanon. In fact, he's been unable to get Netanyahu to halt his attacks on Gaza as well. Remember, Donald Trump has been seemingly frustrated with the Gaza conflict. The war began after the October 7th massacre by Hamas that killed about 1,200 people in Israel. Hostage negotiations have produced temporary breakthroughs, but remember, a permanent settlement remains elusive. Donald Trump has been unable to convince the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to not violate the ceasefire. Time and again, the US president has been pretty vocal about his desire to be the peacemaker in this war, but the conflict has only deepened following the Iran war. On to the Russia-Ukraine conflict now. Remember, during his presidential campaign, Trump has repeatedly promised to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. Yet, the conflict continues more than 4 years after Russia's full-scale attack. The war, in fact, has become Europe's largest conflict since World War II. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed or wounded on both sides. Now, the United States has committed well over $100 billion in military, economic, and humanitarian support to Ukraine since 2022. In air defense, America has provided multiple Patriot missile batteries and interceptors to shoot down ballistic and hypersonic missiles, Stinger and Hawk missiles, over 270 Tower 155mm and 105mm howitzers, HIMARS, or what is called the High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, upwards of 700,000 mortar systems and rounds, dozens of Abrams main battle tanks, hundreds of Bradley and Stryker infantry fighting vehicles, over 10,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles, and tens of thousands of other anti-armor weapons. But despite military support and multiple diplomatic initiatives, neither Moscow nor Kiev has accepted a peace framework that could essentially permanently stop the fighting. For Trump, remember, ending this war was supposed to be a signature achievement. Instead, it remains one of the biggest unfinished agendas in his foreign policy so far. Shifting our focus to tariffs now. No policy better captures Donald Trump's economic philosophy than his tariffs. In April of 2025, Trump had imposed a baseline 10% tariff on imports entering the United States and introduced higher reciprocal tariffs on dozens of trading partners. The administration argued that these measures are rebuilding American manufacturing and forcing foreign governments to negotiate. However, economists remain divided over whether tariffs will revive manufacturing or simply raise costs for consumers, which, by the way, is now being seen across America. As per Forbes, Americans bore 90% of tariff increase last year. $1,000 to $2,400 were added to the average household budgets, and food, healthcare, as well as new vehicle costs worsened, clearly impacting the lower-income households the most. Add to this the impact of the Iran war on gasoline prices, which is increasing the burden on Americans. President Trump's tariffs have lost repeatedly in the courts as well. Remember, he invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, but it was condemned not just by the Supreme Court, but by the Court of International Trade and the Federal Circuit as well. His use of temporary balance of payments authority was rejected by the Court of International Trade. He's now turned to Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act, which essentially allows the president's discretionary retaliatory authority, and it requires only an accusation followed by a determination that the foreign country has engaged in an unreasonable conduct which burdens or restricts U.S. commerce, and therefore the tariffs are needed. And then there is perhaps a most unusual item on the list of promises that Donald Trump has faltered upon so far. the Grand White House Ballroom. Trump has advocated for a large state ballroom capable of hosting major events. To his critics, it is a symbol of presidential grandeur. In fact, the National Trust for Historic Preservation has filed a lawsuit to halt the construction, saying that the White House does not have congressional approval. Now, while an appeals court did allow Trump to go ahead, the U.S. president lashed out at the district court judge who had ordered a halt earlier. He said, and I quote him, "Judge Richard Leon, if anything happens, he will be held responsible for the death and destruction caused to our country." Now, whether or not Donald Trump is able to fulfill his promises in the remaining tenure, one thing is for sure. Presidents are often remembered for what they finish. For instance, Ronald Reagan had the Cold War victory. Barack Obama had the Affordable Care Act. Donald Trump's second presidency is still searching for its defining completion. And let me go across to my colleague Susan Teherani. She's joining us live from New York at the moment. Susan, these are crucial months right ahead of the midterm elections, and what a lot of observers and analysts across the world are talking about is the number of claims and promises that the U.S. president had made to Americans and how most of them haven't been fulfilled so far. They are facing their own challenges in their own situations and contexts. What's it looking like for the moment, for the Republicans, for the U.S. president, as we move closer to the midterms?
Well, as we move closer to the midterms, the most important factor for Americans and how Republicans would be able to keep hold of the House, the Senate, or both would be the issue of the economy and inflation. Because Americans understand, while international unresolved issues can't be pinned on the failure of just the president's promises because of the system of checks and balances that we have on this country, where the courts are involved, Congress is involved, and then when it comes to international issues, then you have the adversaries and the parties involved. President Trump did absolutely think that he would be able to resolve these issues quickly at the pace that he is. But I think there is no conception that perhaps the president was able to handle all of these on his own because of the limits of presidential power with a strike of a pen. For example, Russia and Ukraine are involved. And then you have the Iran issue where, of course, you have many parties involved, including Israel, which wouldn't, as we see, is not completely abiding by what the United States wants to say. And you saw that, as you mentioned, in other previous administrations as well. President Barack Obama tried to close Guantanamo. George Bush prematurely said that the war in Iraq was mission accomplished. And then you had President Biden, who thought that he would resolve the Ukraine-Russia war as well. So when it comes to foreign policy issues, what happens on the campaign trail is obviously very different to what happens at the White House. But I think if this administration is able to focus on the economy, focus on the cost of basic living, the inflation that the president hasn't been able to bring down with his administration, despite having control of both houses, then I think that they have a path to victory. Other than that, the prospects look very grim.
All right, Susan, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us at the moment. We'll have to wait and see how this moves forward for President Trump.